November 1937. Mulberry Street, Little Italy. 9:47 p.m. on a Monday night. Bumpy Johnson walked into the Ravenite Social Club carrying a leather briefcase containing $12,000 in cash, and every Italian mobster in the room stopped talking to watch him. Johnson was alone. No bodyguards, no backup waiting outside. Just one black man walking into the heart of mob territory with enough money to buy 3 houses, surrounded by maybe 20 guys who could kill him and dump his body in the East River before anybody in Harlem even knew he was missing. The briefcase wasn't locked. Johnson set it on the table in front of Frank Costello, popped it open without ceremony. Stacks of bills, mostly 20s and 50s, rubber-banded and organized. Costello didn't count it. Didn't even look inside. Just nodded once, closed the briefcase, and slid it to the man sitting beside him. "See you next Monday, Bumpy." "Same time," Johnson replied. Turned around, walked back through the room full of mobsters who parted for him like he owned the place. Out the door. Into the November night. Disappeared into the shadows of Mulberry Street. This happened every Monday. Had been happening every Monday for 18 months. Would keep happening every Monday for the next 30 years. Bumpy Johnson. Walking alone into Little Italy, delivering $12,000 cash to the Italian mob. And nobody touched him. Nobody threatened him. Nobody even looked at him wrong. Before we get into how this impossible arrangement came to exist, how one black gangster from Harlem became untouchable in mob territory, how a handshake deal between criminals lasted 3 decades and changed organized crime forever, do me a favor and hit subscribe. Drop a comment if you think you know how a colored operator convinced Lucky Luciano to let him control Harlem. Trust me, whatever you're thinking, the real story is stranger. What nobody watching Johnson walk into that social club understood, what even most of the mobsters in the room didn't fully grasp, was that this weekly delivery represented something that had never existed before in New York's criminal underworld, an arrangement across racial lines that treated black gangsters and Italian gangsters as business equals. A territorial deal that gave colored operators complete control over their neighborhood while the mob took a cut without interference. A partnership built on mutual respect rather than racial hierarchy. And it all started 18 months earlier, in a Harlem brownstone, with an offer nobody expected. Spring 1936. A brownstone on West 116th Street, between 7th and 8th Avenue. The building belonged to a policy banker named Raymond, who everybody called Slim, though at 240 pounds he was anything but. Slim's parlor, 2nd floor, around 9:30 on a Thursday night in late April. Outside, the street sounds of Harlem coming alive after dinner, radios through open windows. Kids finishing stickball games before their mothers called them in. The L rumbling on 8th Avenue, shaking windows 3 blocks away. Inside Slim's parlor, 12 men sitting in a room thick with cigar smoke and tension. 9 of them were Harlem's remaining independent policy operators, the ones who'd survived Dutch Schultz's takeover attempt, who'd watched Bumpy Johnson drive Schultz out with systematic brutality 8 months earlier. The other 3 were white, Italians, well-dressed, quiet, watching everything with the kind of attention that made people nervous. Ellsworth Bumpy Johnson sat in a leather chair near the window, his back to the street, which should have made him vulnerable but somehow didn't. He was 31 years old, wearing a gray suit that probably cost more than most Harlem families made in a month, and he hadn't said a word in the 20 minutes since the white men arrived. The oldest Italian, perhaps 45, sat across from Johnson. His name was Frank Costello, and if you knew anything about New York's criminal landscape in 1936, you understood that Costello didn't make house calls to Harlem brownstones for small reasons. Costello represented Lucky Luciano, which meant he represented the organization that controlled most of Manhattan's criminal economy. The docks, the protection rackets, the import operations that brought Canadian whiskey and Italian wine past federal agents who could be persuaded to look elsewhere. What they did not know was that this meeting would establish a framework that would govern Harlem's rackets for the next 30 years, creating an arrangement so unusual, so contrary to how territory normally worked in the criminal world, that other mob families would study it as either brilliant pragmatism or dangerous precedent depending on who was doing the analysis. Costello lit a cigarette, took his time with it, letting the silence build. Then he spoke, his voice carrying the educated precision of someone who'd worked very hard to remove any trace of Italian immigrant roughness. "Mr. Johnson, Mr. Luciano asked me to speak with you about a business proposition. You know who Mr. Prosolak, Luciano, is, what he controls, what he's built since the Castellammarese War ended. You understand that when Mr. Teversol was Luciano makes an offer, it comes from a position of considerable strength." Johnson nodded once, said nothing. His face gave away absolutely nothing. Costello continued. "The Schultz situation last year, that was impressive. Brutal, but impressive. 8 men in 7 days. Very precise. Very effective. It demonstrated capability that frankly surprised people downtown. Most of us thought Schultz would roll through Harlem in 6 months, take over everything, and that would be that. You proved otherwise. One of the Harlem operators, a man named Vernon who ran numbers on the east side, shifted in his seat, made a small sound like he was about to say something. Johnson raised one finger without looking at him, and Vernon went quiet immediately. Costello smiled slightly. Good discipline. That matters. Mr. Luciano appreciates discipline. So here's the situation. Schultz is dead now, as you know, shot in Newark last October. Which means the question of who controls what territory in Manhattan is open for discussion. Several families want Harlem. They see the money flowing through the policy banks, they see the protection fees from the clubs and the speakeasies, they see opportunity. He paused. Let that sink in. Made sure everyone in the room understood that Italian families with substantially more resources than Dutch Schultz had ever possessed were looking at Harlem as acquisition territory. But, Mr. Kasha, Luciano has a different perspective. He thinks fighting for Harlem would be expensive. Bloody. Would attract attention from the police and the feds at a time when we're trying to keep things quiet, build legitimate business fronts, operate professionally. He also thinks that trying to control Harlem from downtown, using white operators in a colored neighborhood, that's a losing strategy long term. Schultz proved that. Johnson spoke for the first time. His voice was quiet, completely neutral. So what's Mr. Luciano's perspective? Lead him to propose. Costello stubbed out his cigarette. Started on another one. You control Harlem. Completely. All the policy operations, all the protection, all the street-level rackets. You run it however you want. We don't send people in, we don't interfere with your operations, we don't tell you how to do business. Harlem belongs to Harlem. Operated by Harlem people, for Harlem people. Vernon made that sound again. This time Johnson let him speak. Vernon's voice carried the edge of someone who thought he was being played. And what does Mr. Luciano get in return for this generous offer? What's the catch? Costello didn't look at Vernon. Kept his eyes on Johnson. 20% of gross receipts from all operations. Policy banks, numbers running, protection, prostitution, drug sales if that becomes part of your business. We take 20% off the top, every week, delivered to a location we'll specify. That's the price for exclusive rights to operate in Harlem without interference from any Italian family. The room exploded. 9 Harlem operators started talking at once, voices overlapping in protest and disbelief. 20%. That was robbery. That was tribute paid to conquerors. That was exactly what Schultz had demanded, what Johnson had killed 8 men to prevent. Johnson raised his hand. The room went silent again. That silence itself was remarkable. Demonstrated a level of authority Johnson had built in 8 months, through reputation and fear and the memory of what happened to people who crossed him. What happens if other families don't accept this arrangement? Johnson asked. What happens if Genovese or Profaci decides they want Harlem regardless of what Mr. Luciano agreed to? Costello's expression didn't change. Then, they deal with Mr. Luciano. That's part of what you're paying for. Protection. The commission recognizes Mr. Frank Luciano's authority to make these arrangements. If someone violates that, it becomes Mr. Johnson. Luciano's problem to solve, not yours. And if we say no? If we decide we'd rather stay independent, take our chances with whoever tries to move in, then within 6 months, probably less, one of the families takes over Harlem by force. Could be Genovese, could be Profaci, could be Mangano, doesn't really matter who. They'll come in with more men and more money than Schultz ever had, and they'll grind you down through sustained pressure until you're either dead or working for them anyway. Except in that scenario, you won't get to keep control of operations. You'll become employees, taking orders from downtown bosses who don't understand Harlem and don't particularly care about colored operators except as labor. Costello leaned forward slightly. Mr. Luciano is offering you something unusual here. Real authority over your own territory. The right to run things your way, keep 80% of what you make, operate independently as long as you pay the tax. That's a better deal than most neighborhoods get. Hell, that's a better deal than most Italian crews get. But it requires Mr. Seven. Luciano to spend political capital with other families, convince them that Harlem should be hands-off territory, that trying to control it directly would cost more than it's worth. He stood up. Conversation apparently over. You've got 3 days to decide. Saturday night I come back here, same time, and you tell me yes or no. If yes, we formalize terms, set up payment protocols, and Mr. Luciano guarantees no Italian family operates in Harlem without your explicit permission. If no, then come Sunday morning this offer disappears, and Harlem becomes open territory for whoever wants to fight for it. Costello walked to the door, stopped, turned back. One more thing. Mr. Luciano specifically requested I tell you this. He knows what Schultz said to you at the Cotton Club last September, the names he called you, the disrespect. Mr. Luciano considers that unacceptable. The way Mr. Luciano sees it, business is business regardless of race. You pay your debts, you honor agreements, you show respect to people who've earned it. Schultz violated those principles. Mr. Luciano doesn't operate that way, and he doesn't allow his people to operate that way. This arrangement isn't charity, Mr. Johnson. It's not white people being generous to colored operators. It's business between professionals who understand that some territories are better controlled by the people who actually live there, who understand the community, who can operate without creating the resentment that outsiders generate. Mr. Luciano thinks you're the person who can make Harlem work efficiently. That's why he's offering this deal. 3 days. Think about it. The 3 Italians left. The door closed. The 9 Harlem operators sat in stunned silence for perhaps 30 seconds. Then everybody started talking at once again. Chapter 2. The World Before the Deal. To understand why Lucky Luciano made this offer, why it was both brilliant and risky, you need to understand what Harlem looked like in spring 1936, 8 months after Bumpy Johnson had driven Dutch Schultz out through systematic execution of Schultz's key operators. Harlem in 1936 was the cultural and economic center of Black America. Nearly 300,000 colored people lived in a neighborhood roughly 40 blocks long and 10 blocks wide. From 110th Street to 155th Street, river to river, the population density was crushing. Families doubled and tripled up in apartments meant for half as many people. Rents were astronomical because white landlords knew colored tenants had limited options elsewhere in the city. But despite poverty and overcrowding and systematic discrimination, Harlem was thriving in ways that confused white New Yorkers, who'd never actually visited the neighborhood. The clubs were packed every night. The Apollo Theater drew crowds from across the city. Small businesses lined every commercial street, barbershops and beauty parlors and restaurants and tailors and markets. The churches were full on Sundays. The streets were alive with a kind of energy that came from hundreds of thousands of people creating their own economy, their own culture, their own systems, because the larger white city had made clear they weren't welcome in downtown institutions. The criminal economy in Harlem was massive. Later estimates would suggest that illegal gambling, primarily through policy banks where people bet pennies on number combinations, moved perhaps $50 million annually through the neighborhood. That's equivalent to roughly $1 billion today, adjusted for inflation. Protection rackets added millions more. Prostitution, though less organized than the gambling operations, generated substantial income. Bootlegging, even though prohibition had ended in 1933, continued because legal liquor carried heavy taxes that illegal suppliers avoided. All that money flowing through a neighborhood where legitimate employment was scarce, where colored workers were systematically excluded from most union jobs and most skilled professions, where a college-educated black man might work as a porter or a waiter because white firms wouldn't hire him for anything else. The criminal economy in Harlem wasn't just parallel to the legitimate economy. It was often more reliable, more accessible, and more lucrative than legal work for people shut out of mainstream employment. Before Dutch Schultz's takeover attempt, Harlem's criminal operations had been controlled primarily by black operators. The most famous was Madame Stephanie Saint Claire, called Queenie by associates and rivals, a woman who'd built a policy empire that at its peak generated perhaps $200,000 annually for her personally. Casper Holstein, another major operator, had controlled significant territory on the west side. Dozens of smaller operators ran neighborhood banks, took bets, paid winners, employed hundreds of runners who collected numbers, slips, and money from thousands of daily players. The system worked reasonably well. The operators were Harlem people. They lived in the neighborhood, knew the community, had relationships with churches and social clubs and legitimate businesses. They employed local people as runners and collectors. They sponsored community events, provided loans when people needed emergency money, operated with the kind of informal social contract that made them criminals, certainly, but criminals who at least pretended to care about Harlem rather than just extracting money from it. Dutch Schultz destroyed that system. Between 1933 and September 1935, Schultz systematically forced out or killed nearly every major black operator in Harlem. Madame St. Keith. Claire eventually fled to Paris after months of warfare that left several of her key people dead. Casper Holstein was kidnapped, beaten, and threatened until he agreed to leave the business entirely. Smaller operators either accepted partnerships with Schultz, which really meant working for him while he took most of the profit, or they were driven out through violence. Schultz's method was overwhelming force combined with political connections and police cooperation. He had more money than any Harlem operator could match. He had relationships with Tammany Hall politicians who could deliver police protection or at least police indifference. He had the implicit backing of being white in a city where that still mattered enormously in terms of what you could get away with. By summer 1935, Schultz controlled perhaps 70% of Harlem's policy operations. His collectors were mostly white men who came into the neighborhood, took money, and left. His managers operated from offices downtown. The money flowed out of Harlem into Schultz's pockets, then into his investments in legitimate businesses, real estate, political contributions that bought him more protection. The Harlem community hated it, resented the white men collecting bets, resented the contempt Schultz's people showed for black operators and black customers, resented knowing that their nickels and dimes were enriching a white gangster downtown rather than staying in the community even through criminal channels. That resentment was why Bumpy Johnson had been able to kill 8 of Schultz's men in 7 days without anybody in Harlem cooperating with Schultz's investigation. The community had protected Johnson because killing Schultz's operators felt like payback for months of humiliation and exploitation. But when Schultz died in October 1935, killed by other Italian gangsters who decided he was too reckless and too likely to bring federal attention to all their operations, the question of who would control Harlem became wide open. Several Italian families wanted it. The Genovese family, Vito Genovese himself, hungry to expand his operations after the Castellamarese War, had redrawn territorial boundaries throughout the city. The Profaki family, looking at Harlem's gambling revenues and seeing opportunity. Even smaller families were interested, sensing that with Schultz dead and Harlem's black operators weakened from years of warfare, the neighborhood could be taken relatively easily. Lucky Luciano understood something those other families didn't. Or maybe he did understand and just disagreed with the strategic calculation. Luciano, born Salvatore Lucania in Sicily in 1897, had become by 1936 probably the most powerful criminal in America. He'd been instrumental in organizing what historians later called the Commission, a kind of board of directors for Italian organized crime families in New York, designed to prevent the kind of destructive warfare between families that had killed dozens of people in the early 1930s. Luciano thought strategically, long-term rather than immediate profit. He wanted organized crime to operate more like corporations and less like street gangs. He wanted stability, predictability, reduced police attention, reduced newspaper coverage, reduced federal investigation. He wanted to make so much money that fighting over territory would seem counterproductive compared to cooperation. Looking at Harlem, Luciano saw several problems with the conventional approach of Italian families simply taking over. First, occupying Harlem would require substantial manpower. You'd need collectors, enforcers, managers, all operating in a neighborhood where they'd be outsiders, where the community would resent them, where violence would be necessary to maintain control. That's expensive in money and in attention drawn to your operations. Second, Harlem's geography made it difficult to control from downtown. Italian families operated primarily below 110th Street. Harlem was physically separate, different neighborhood, different community, different informal power structures. Trying to manage operations from miles away, using people who didn't understand local dynamics, that seemed like asking for ongoing problems. Third, and perhaps most importantly, Bumpy Johnson had proven that black operators in Harlem could be formidable opponents. Johnson had killed 8 men in 7 days with precision that suggested serious organizational capability. He'd done it while evading Dutch Schultz's entire organization, which had been actively searching for him with substantial resources. That demonstrated competence Italian families would have to take seriously. Luciano's calculation was simple. Fighting for Harlem would cost money and lives and attention. Winning would require ongoing occupation that would continue costing money and lives and attention. But making a deal with Johnson, letting him control Harlem while taking a substantial cut that would generate reliable income without the costs of occupation, without the attention of warfare, without the need to operate in a neighborhood where your people would always be outsiders. 20% of Harlem's criminal economy was still millions of dollars annually, and 20% paid voluntarily, or at least without the need for ongoing warfare, was more valuable than 40% that required constant enforcement. The risk was that other Italian families would see this as weakness, would argue that letting colored operators control territory set bad precedent, would push back against the arrangement as violating some unwritten rule about racial hierarchies in criminal organizations. Luciano was betting he had enough authority within the commission to make this arrangement stick, despite objections. He was betting that the other families would accept his logic once he explained it, and he was betting that Johnson would be professional enough, competent enough, and smart enough to run Harlem efficiently and pay the tax reliably. That last part was crucial. If Johnson couldn't maintain control of Harlem's rackets, If smaller operators started fighting amongst themselves, if the territory descended into chaos that attracted police attention and federal investigation, then the arrangement would fail. Other families would argue Luciano had been wrong, that Harlem needed direct Italian control, and Luciano's authority within the commission would be damaged. So when Frank Costello walked into that brownstone parlor on West 116th Street in April 1936, he wasn't just making a business offer. He was representing a strategic gamble by the most powerful organized crime figure in America that giving Bumpy Johnson autonomy over Harlem would be more profitable and more stable than trying to control it directly. Chapter 3. 3 Days of Calculation. Friday morning, April 24, 1936. Bumpy Johnson sat in his apartment on West 139th Street, drinking coffee that had gone cold, staring at nothing in particular, working through the implications of Lucky Luciano's offer. The apartment was modest for a man who'd just been offered control of Harlem's entire criminal economy. 3 rooms, clean but not fancy. The furniture was good quality but not ostentatious. Johnson didn't believe in displays, didn't want people knowing how much money he had, where he kept it, what he owned. The less visible you were, the harder you were to target. Vernon showed up around 10 a.m., let himself in without knocking, sat down across from Johnson without being invited. Vernon was agitated, had probably been up all night thinking about Costello's offer. "This is a trap," Vernon said. "Has to be. Luciano doesn't give away territory for 20%. He takes it all. That's how Italians operate. They come in, they take over, they squeeze out everybody who was there before. Schultz tried it. Luciano will do the same thing, just using different tactics." Johnson sipped his cold coffee. Didn't respond immediately. Let Vernon talk himself out. Vernon kept going. "And even if it's not a trap, even if Luciano means what he says right now, what happens in 6 months? What happens when he decides 20% isn't enough? What happens when Genovese or one of the other families says they want Harlem regardless of what Luciano agreed to? We'll be paying tribute to downtown, depending on their protection, and the moment they decide we're not useful anymore, they'll crush us." Johnson finally spoke. "What's your alternative?" Vernon blinked. "What? What would you do instead?" "If I say no to Luciano, what's your plan?" Vernon started to answer, stopped, thought about it. "I don't know. Stay independent? Fight whoever comes after us?" Johnson set down his coffee cup, thought for a moment before responding. Accounts differ on what was said in this conversation, but multiple associates later claimed Johnson laid out his thinking with the kind of systematic clarity that explained why he'd become the dominant figure in Harlem despite being only 31 years old. "Here's what happens if I say no," Johnson said. "Within 2 weeks, maybe less, Genovese or Profaci, or both, start moving people into Harlem. They'll make contact with some of our smaller operators, offer them partnerships. Some will accept because they're scared, because they don't think we can fight off Italian families. That fractures our unity immediately. Then the violence starts. They'll kill a few of our people to demonstrate capability. We'll kill some of theirs. That attracts police attention, newspaper coverage, maybe federal investigation if it gets bloody enough. While we're fighting, our operations deteriorate. Collections drop. Customers get nervous. Money stops flowing reliably. After 3 months, maybe 4, we're weakened enough that one of the families makes a major push. 50 guys, maybe more, coming into Harlem to take over by force. We can't match that. Schultz had maybe 20 people operating in Harlem at his peak. An Italian family fully committed to take over will send 3 or 4 times that many." Johnson stood up, walked to the window, looked out at the street below. "So we lose. Either we get killed fighting, or we surrender and work for whoever takes over." "And in that scenario, Vernon, what percentage of the rackets do you think we'd control? Because it won't be 80%. It won't be 50%. It'll be whatever salary they decide to pay us as employees in their operation." Vernon was quiet, thinking it through. Finally, he asked, "So you're going to say yes? Just accept Luciano's deal?" Johnson turned from the window. "I'm going to do what's best for Harlem. And what's best for Harlem is maintaining control of our own rackets, making our own decisions, keeping most of the money in the neighborhood, even if we have to pay tribute to downtown to make that happen." "But that's exactly what Schultz wanted," Vernon protested. "That's what we killed 8 men to prevent." "No," Johnson said sharply. "What Schultz wanted was total control. He wanted to replace us entirely, run everything himself, treat Harlem like occupied territory where his people came in and extracted money and left. Luciano's offering something different. He's offering to let us keep running things while he takes a cut. That's not the same." Vernon looked skeptical. "You really believe he'll honor that? That he won't gradually increase the pressure, demand more and more until we're working for him anyway?" "I don't know," Johnson admitted. "Could be a trick. Could be that 6 months from now Luciano decides the arrangement isn't working and sends people to take over. But here's what I do know. Right now, today, we're not strong enough to fight off Italian families if they decide they want Harlem. We're strong enough to hold territory against independents, against operators like Schultz was. But a coordinated push by 2 or 3 families? We'd lose. He sat back down. So the question isn't whether Luciano's deal is perfect. It's whether it's better than the alternatives. And the alternatives are either fight and lose, or wait and get taken over anyway. At least with Luciano's deal, we maintain some control, keep some authority, get protection against other families trying to move in. Friday afternoon, Johnson met with 3 other major Harlem operators. These men controlled significant territory, had their own crews, had survived the Schultz era through a combination of competence and luck. Getting their cooperation would be essential if the Luciano arrangement was going to work. The most important was a man named Junie Bird, who ran numbers on the east side, controlled maybe 20 runners, had relationships with several Harlem churches that gave him legitimacy in the community beyond his criminal activities. Bird was older than Johnson, perhaps 40, had been in the rackets longer, commanded respect. Bird listened to Johnson's explanation of Luciano's offer, listened without interrupting. Then he asked the crucial question. What happens to us? To operators who've been running things in Harlem for years? Do we become your employees? Do we lose our independence to create a bigger operation that you control? Johnson had known this question was coming, had prepared his answer carefully because if the existing operators thought Johnson was using Luciano's offer to consolidate power for himself, they'd oppose the deal regardless of strategic logic. Nothing changes for you operationally, Johnson said. You keep running your territory. You keep your crews. You make your own decisions. I'm not taking over your operations. What changes is coordination and payment. We need to coordinate so we're not competing with each other, driving down prices, creating the kind of chaos that attracts police attention. And we need to collect the 20% for Luciano efficiently, which means somebody has to organize it. And that somebody is you? Bird asked. Johnson nodded. Luciano's dealing with me because I'm the one who drove out Schultz. He thinks I can keep Harlem organized. So yes, I'll be the point person. I'll collect the 20% from all operations, deliver it downtown, handle any problems with Luciano's people. But I'm not replacing you. I'm not taking your territories. I'm just coordinating. Bird thought about it. Finally, 20% off gross, not net. Johnson confirmed. Gross receipts, before expenses. That's steep, Bird said. That's really steep. Most of us operate on thin margins. 20% off gross could mean 40 or 50% of actual profit. Better than 0% because some Italian family took over and squeezed you out entirely, Johnson replied. Look, I understand it's expensive, but the alternative is worse. And at least this way we're paying for something tangible. Protection, stability, the right to operate without interference. The other operators at the meeting asked variations of the same questions. How much authority would Johnson have? What happened if someone didn't want to participate? What happened if Luciano broke the agreement? Johnson answered patiently, repeated his core argument. This deal was better than the realistic alternatives, and maintaining control over Harlem's rackets, even at the cost of 20%, was preferable to losing control entirely. By Friday evening, Johnson had secured tentative cooperation from most major operators. Not everyone was happy. Several remained suspicious, but the consensus was forming that accepting Luciano's offer made strategic sense given Harlem's weak position in any potential conflict with Italian families. Saturday morning, Johnson met with the one person whose opinion he trusted absolutely. Her name was Mamie, though whether she was his wife or longtime girlfriend varied depending on who was telling the story and when. What's clear is that Mamie was Johnson's closest advisor, the person he consulted before making major decisions, someone whose judgment about people and situations he valued more than anyone else's. They walked through Morningside Park, away from apartments where conversations might be overheard, away from people who knew Johnson's face and would recognize him. Just 2 people having a quiet conversation on a Saturday morning while Harlem woke up around them. Mamie listened to Johnson's explanation of Luciano's offer, the arguments he'd made to other operators, the consensus that was building toward acceptance. Then she asked the question that cut to the heart of Johnson's real concern. Do you trust him? Do you trust Luciano to honor this deal? Johnson was quiet for a long moment. I don't know him, he finally said. Don't know if he's someone who keeps agreements or someone who makes promises he doesn't intend to keep. But I know his reputation. I know he's been building the commission, trying to create stability between families, trying to operate professionally rather than through constant warfare. That suggests he values reliable arrangements over short-term. Mamie stopped walking, looked at him directly. That's not an answer. I asked if you trust him, not whether his reputation suggests trustworthiness. Johnson smiled slightly. No, I don't trust him. Don't trust any white gangster after what Schultz did, but I trust his self-interest. I trust that he's smart enough to understand that a reliable 20% is more valuable than fighting for Harlem and dealing with ongoing resistance and police attention. As long as our interests align, the deal should hold. And when your interests stop aligning, then we have bigger problems than whether I should have said yes or no today, Johnson said. If Luciano decides he wants more than 20%, if he decides to violate the arrangement, we'll be in the same position we're in now. Weak compared to Italian families, vulnerable to takeover. The deal buys us time, buys us stability to rebuild, strengthen our position, maybe eventually get strong enough that we don't need protection from downtown. They walked in silence for several minutes. Finally, May spoke. You're going to say yes. It wasn't a question. Johnson nodded anyway. I'm going to say yes. Because 20% paid to Luciano for protection is better than losing everything to Genovese or Profaci. Because maintaining control of Harlem, even with that tax, is preferable to becoming employees in someone else's operation. And because I don't see a realistic alternative that doesn't involve us eventually getting crushed, Mamie considered. Then you need to make sure every operator understands the rules. Make sure everyone pays their share. Make sure nobody tries to cheat on the 20%, because the moment Luciano thinks we're stealing from him, this whole arrangement collapses. Saturday night, 9:30 p.m. Slim's brownstone parlor again. Same room, same chairs, same cigar smoke. The 9 Harlem operators, waiting. At 9:45, Frank Costello arrived with his 2 associates. Costello sat down, looked at Johnson. Well, Johnson let the moment hang. Let everyone in the room understand this was a decision point, a moment when Harlem's future was being determined. Then he spoke. We accept Mr. Luciano's offer. 20% of gross receipts from all Harlem operations, paid weekly. In exchange, exclusive operating rights in Harlem with protection against interference from other families. Costello nodded, like they'd never doubted this would be the answer. Terms are as follows. Starting next Monday, you'll deliver payment weekly to a location we'll provide. Always the same location, always the same time, always the same person making delivery. That person is you, Mr. Johnson. We deal with you directly, not with intermediaries. We'll provide accounting oversight, not management. We're not running your operations. But we need to verify the 20% is accurate. That means occasional audits of your policy banks, your collections, your protection fees. You cooperate with those audits, provide accurate records, don't try to hide revenue. In exchange, no Italian family operates in Harlem without your explicit permission. We'll make that clear to Genovese, Profaci, everyone. They stay out, and if they don't, we deal with them. That's the protection you're paying for. Costello stood up, held out his hand. Johnson stood as well, shook hands. The deal was made. One more thing, Costello said. Mr. Luciano wanted me to tell you this. He respects how you handled the Schultz situation, respects that you stood up for your territory, defended your people, demonstrated capability. This arrangement isn't charity. It's business between professionals. You maintain your end, keep Harlem organized, pay the tax reliably, we maintain our end, and keep other families out. Simple as that. Monday morning, April 27, 1936. Bumpy Johnson became, in effect, the boss of Harlem's criminal underworld, authorized by Lucky Luciano to control all rackets in the neighborhood in exchange for 20% of revenue. The arrangement was unusual enough that other mob families initially objected, argued that Luciano was setting dangerous precedent by giving colored operators this much autonomy. But Luciano made it stick, used his authority within the commission to insist this was the right strategic approach. And he was proven correct. For the next 30 years, the Johnson-Luciano arrangement generated millions of dollars for both sides, maintained stability in Harlem that allowed criminal operations to flourish without the kind of warfare that attracted federal investigation, and established a model of territorial control that respected local operators' expertise while ensuring downtown interests received their cut. Chapter 4. Building the Machine. The arrangement with Lucky Luciano solved one problem immediately. It eliminated the threat of Italian families fighting over Harlem, trying to seize control through overwhelming force. But it created a new, equally difficult challenge. Bumpy Johnson now had to actually control Harlem's criminal economy, had to organize dozens of independent operators into a coordinated system, had to ensure that the 20% owed to Luciano was collected reliably, and he had to do all of that while maintaining enough community support that Harlem residents didn't revolt against what could easily look like Italian mob control with a colored face. May 1936. Johnson spent the first month after making the deal with Costello doing something that surprised people who'd expected him to immediately start consolidating power through force. He talked, visited every significant operator in Harlem personally, explained the arrangement, listened to concerns, negotiated. His message was consistent. The Luciano deal protected everyone, It meant stability. It meant Italian families couldn't come in and take over individual operators' territories. It meant Harlem rackets could operate with substantially less police interference because Luciano had connections that could deliver protection from both the NYPD and federal agencies. But, Johnson explained repeatedly, the deal only worked if everyone participated. If some operators refused to pay the 20%, Luciano would view that as Johnson failing to control his territory. That would give Luciano justification to void the arrangement and let other families come in. So everyone had to pay, not as tribute to Johnson personally, but as the price of maintaining Harlem's autonomy. Most operators accepted this logic, some grudgingly, some with real enthusiasm, but generally there was recognition that Johnson's arrangement with Luciano was better than realistic alternatives. A few pushed back, refused to participate, said they'd been independent for years and weren't starting to pay tribute now regardless of who demanded it. Johnson handled these holdouts carefully, didn't immediately resort to violence. Instead, he let them experience isolation. Other operators who'd accepted the arrangement stopped cooperating with the holdouts, stopped sharing information, stopped providing the informal mutual support that made Harlem's criminal economy function. The holdouts found themselves operating alone against a coordinated network that had Johnson's backing and, indirectly, Luciano's protection. 2 holdouts left Harlem voluntarily, decided the cost of independence wasn't worth the isolation. One tried to cut a direct deal with the Perfacchi family, attempted to bring Italian operators into his territory in exchange for protection. Johnson learned about this within 2 days. The treacherous operator was found in an alley near his apartment, beaten severely but not killed, with a message pinned to his jacket: Harlem handles its own business. The message was clear. Johnson would tolerate disagreement, would negotiate with people who had concerns, but wouldn't tolerate operators trying to bring in outside families that would undermine the Luciano arrangement. After that incident, the remaining holdouts accepted that participation wasn't optional. By June 1936, Johnson had organized Harlem's criminal economy into a system that historians later described as remarkably sophisticated for its time. He established a collection network where smaller operators paid their 20% to designated collectors who reported to Johnson's primary lieutenants. These lieutenants compiled accounting, verified amounts, and forwarded the money to Johnson, who made weekly deliveries to Costello's designated location, a social club in Little Italy on Mulberry Street. Johnson also established enforcement mechanisms. He created a reputation committee, essentially a group of respected operators, who would hear disputes between criminals, adjudicate disagreements about territory or customers or money, and issue decisions that all parties agreed in advance to accept. This reduced violence within Harlem's criminal community, prevented the kind of destructive internal warfare that attracted police attention and disrupted operations. For disputes the Reputation Committee couldn't resolve, Johnson himself served as final arbiter. His decisions were usually pragmatic rather than strictly fair. He'd rule in favor of whoever would cause less disruption if they won, or whoever had better community connections, or whoever was more important to maintaining Harlem's overall stability. This wasn't justice in any traditional sense, but it was effective conflict resolution that kept the criminal economy functioning smoothly. The Reputation Committee also handled discipline. When operators cheated customers, when they failed to pay winners, when they engaged in the kind of petty theft or betrayal that undermined community trust, the committee would investigate and impose penalties, sometimes fines, sometimes temporary suspension from operations, sometimes, for serious violations, permanent expulsion from Harlem's rackets. This system worked because it aligned incentives. Operators who played by the rules, who paid the 20% reliably, who maintained good relationships with the community, they prospered under Johnson's arrangement. Their territories were protected, disputes were resolved relatively fairly. They had backing from Johnson's organization if they faced external threats. Operators who didn't play by the rules found themselves isolated, disciplined, sometimes violently ejected from the business. Johnson didn't need to personally enforce discipline often because the system itself created peer pressure. Operators policed each other because everyone understood that if Harlem's rackets descended into chaos, Luciano would void the arrangement and let other families take over. By summer 1936, the system was generating approximately $12,000 weekly for Luciano. That's roughly $250,000 weekly in today's dollars. Annually, Luciano was receiving something close to $600,000 from the Harlem arrangement, equivalent to perhaps $12 million today. That was serious money. More importantly, it was reliable money that arrived weekly without Luciano needing to invest resources in managing Harlem operations directly. For Johnson and Harlem's operators, the remaining 80% represented even more substantial income, something close to $2.4 million annually in 1936, perhaps $50 million annually in modern terms. That money stayed largely within Harlem, employed hundreds of runners and collectors, supported families, flowed into legitimate businesses and real estate. The arrangement was profitable enough that by late 1936, some Italian families who'd initially objected to Luciano's deal started reconsidering. Genovese, who'd been most vocal in opposing the arrangement, reportedly told associates that maybe Luciano had the right idea after all. Why fight for territory that could be managed profitably through arrangement with local operators? Chapter 5. The Test. Nobody expected November 1937. 18 months into the arrangement, the system Johnson had built was functioning smoothly. Weekly payments to Costello were reliable and accurate. Harlem's criminal economy was more organized and more profitable than it had been during the chaotic Schultz era. Police interference was minimal because Luciano's political connections delivered the protection he'd promised. Then Vincent Mangano decided to test whether Luciano would actually defend the Harlem arrangement. Mangano ran one of the 5 major Italian families in New York. His operations were primarily in Brooklyn, controlled the docks and various labor rackets. But Mangano had ambitions, wanted to expand into Manhattan, saw Harlem as attractive territory that Luciano had essentially given away to colored operators. In November 1937, Mangano sent 4 of his men into Harlem. They approached several small policy operators, offered them partnerships. The terms were straightforward. The operators would continue running their policy banks, but Mangano's people would provide protection, handle any problems with larger operators or with Johnson's organization. In exchange, the operators would pay Mangano 25%, rather than paying Johnson 20% for delivery to Luciano. It was a direct challenge to Johnson's authority and, more significantly, to Luciano's arrangement. Mangano was essentially arguing that Luciano didn't have the right to give Harlem to colored operators, that territory was open for any family willing to move in. 2 of the operators, Mangano's men, approached immediately, informed Johnson, told him about the offer, asked how they should respond. Johnson's first move was calling Costello. Explained the situation. Said Mangano's people were operating in Harlem in direct violation of the arrangement. Asked what Luciano wanted done. According to accounts from Johnson's associates, Costello's response was immediate and unambiguous. Don't touch Mangano's people. Don't do anything except document what they're doing, who they're talking to, what they're offering. Collect evidence. We'll handle this through the commission. Johnson followed those instructions. Had his people shadow Mangano's men, record their movements, identify everyone they contacted, compiled a detailed report of Mangano's attempted incursion into Harlem, delivered the report to Costello within a week. What happened next demonstrated why Lucky Luciano had become the most powerful organized crime figure in America. He didn't respond to Mangano's challenge with violence, didn't send shooters to kill Mangano's men. Instead, he called a commission meeting. The commission, established in the early 1930s after the Castellamarese War, was essentially Organized Crime's board of directors. Representatives from the major Italian families met periodically to resolve disputes, establish policies, prevent the kind of destructive warfare that had nearly destroyed several families in previous decades. At the December 1937 commission meeting, Luciano presented evidence of Mangano's Harlem incursion, made clear this wasn't just about Harlem, but about whether the commission's territorial agreements had any meaning. He'd made a deal with Johnson. Other families had been informed. The commission had tacitly approved. Mangano violating that deal wasn't just disrespecting Luciano personally. It was challenging the commission's authority to make binding territorial arrangements. The details of what happened at that meeting remain disputed. No transcripts exist, no official records. But the outcome was clear. Mangano was ordered to withdraw his people from Harlem immediately, was fined a substantial amount, reportedly $50,000, as compensation to Luciano for the disruption, and was warned that future violations would result in more severe consequences. By late December 1937, Mangano's men had left Harlem. The operators they'd approached received visits from Johnson's people, not to punish them for entertaining Mangano's offers, but to reinforce that the Luciano arrangement remained in effect and would be defended. This incident had enormous significance. It proved Luciano would actually protect the Harlem arrangement when challenged. It demonstrated that the commission backed Luciano's authority to make this kind of deal, and it sent a message to other families that trying to muscle into Harlem would be more trouble than it was worth. For Johnson, the Mangano incident validated his decision to accept Luciano's deal. The protection he'd been promised was real. Luciano hadn't abandoned the arrangement when it was tested. That meant the system Johnson had built could operate with confidence that Italian families wouldn't be able to simply ignore the territorial boundaries and move in whenever they wanted. Chapter 6. The Rules That Governed an Empire by 1938. 2 years into the arrangement, the Johnson-Luciano partnership had established patterns that would govern Harlem's criminal economy for the next 3 decades. These weren't written rules. Nobody signed contracts. But everyone involved understood the principles that made the system work. First principle: Harlem operators maintained complete operational control. Luciano's organization didn't tell Johnson how to run policy banks, didn't dictate prices, didn't interfere with enforcement or dispute resolution. As long as the 20% was paid reliably and accurately, Johnson had autonomy to manage Harlem however he thought best. This was unusual. Most territorial arrangements between Italian families and non-Italian operators involved much more control by the Italian side. They'd install managers, supervise collections, make operational decisions. Luciano's arrangement with Johnson was genuinely hands-off. Second principle: accurate accounting. Johnson maintained detailed records of policy receipts, protection fees, all revenue streams. When Luciano's people occasionally audited the books, the numbers matched Johnson's reported payments. This built trust, demonstrated Johnson was running operations professionally, not trying to cheat on the 20%. The accounting also protected Johnson. If anyone accused him of skimming, he could produce records showing he'd been paying correctly. And if anyone challenged his authority in Harlem, he could show Luciano's organization that he was managing territory competently. Third principle: community stability. Luciano cared about this not because of any moral concern, but because chaos attracted attention. If Harlem's criminal economy generated headlines, if there were spectacular murders or public warfare between operators, that would bring police and potentially federal investigation. Johnson understood this completely. He enforced discipline within Harlem's criminal community specifically to prevent the kind of visible violence that would threaten the arrangement. Disputes were resolved through the Reputation Committee. Operators who couldn't control their tempers were removed from the business. Public shootings and obvious criminal activity were minimized. This made Harlem's rackets simultaneously massive and relatively invisible. Thousands of people participated daily in illegal gambling, but it was so thoroughly integrated into community life that it didn't feel like dramatic crime. Just everyday transactions that happened to be illegal but were accepted as normal neighborhood activity. Fourth principle: racial respect. This was perhaps Luciano's most unusual requirement. After what Dutch Schultz had done at the Cotton Club in 1935, after the humiliation that had precipitated Johnson killing 8 men in 7 days, Luciano insisted that Italian operators and representatives treat black gangsters professionally. When Costello or other representatives met with Johnson, they did so respectfully. No slurs, no condescension. Business discussions between equals, despite the obvious racial hierarchies that existed in broader American society. This wasn't idealism on Luciano's part. It was pragmatism. He understood that if his people disrespected Johnson, it would create the kind of resentment that had undermined Schultz's operations. Fifth principle: proportional response to problems. When issues arose, as they inevitably did, both sides addressed them carefully rather than escalating immediately to violence. For example, in 1939, one of Johnson's collectors was stealing money rather than forwarding it to Johnson for payment to Luciano. Johnson discovered this through routine accounting review. Rather than killing the collector, which would have been the street-level response, Johnson documented the theft, recovered what money he could, reported the situation to Luciano's people, and had the collector banned from any criminal operations in Harlem. This proportional approach meant problems could be solved without destroying the arrangement. Small issues didn't spiral into major conflicts because both sides understood that maintaining the partnership was more valuable than winning individual disputes. Chapter 7: What Harlem Never Forgot. The Johnson-Luciano arrangement lasted, in various forms, until Johnson's death in 1968. Even after Luciano was deported to Italy in 1946, the territorial agreement remained in effect. Other Italian mob figures maintained the relationship with Johnson, continued receiving the tax from Harlem operations, continued providing protection against families trying to move into the neighborhood. The arrangement generated enormous wealth for everyone involved. Luciano received millions of dollars over the years without needing to manage Harlem directly. Johnson became one of the wealthiest black men in New York, used his criminal proceeds to invest in legitimate businesses, real estate, became a fixture in Harlem's community despite his criminal activities. But the most significant legacy wasn't financial. It was the proof that territorial arrangements across racial lines could be maintained professionally, that black operators could manage large criminal enterprises competently, that cooperation was more profitable than conflict. Other cities studied the Johnson-Luciano model. Detroit, Chicago, Philadelphia, cities with large black populations and Italian mob presence. Several attempted similar arrangements with mixed results. Some worked for years, others collapsed quickly into warfare. But the fact that it was attempted at all, the fact that mob families in multiple cities considered letting black operators control rackets in black neighborhoods, That represented a shift in how organized crime thought about race and territory. Harlem residents had complicated feelings about Johnson. He was a criminal. He profited from illegal gambling that took money from families who could barely afford to participate. He used violence to maintain control. First part of my bread. Soon, 11:30. He partnered with Italian mobsters who themselves were deeply involved in exploitative criminal enterprises. But Harlem also saw Johnson as someone who'd stood up to Dutch Schultz, who'd driven out white gangsters, who'd treated the neighborhood with contempt, who'd negotiated an arrangement that kept most criminal proceeds flowing within the community rather than downtown. The policy banks employed Harlem people. The money from gambling and protection flowed into Harlem businesses, even if indirectly. Johnson himself was visibly present in the neighborhood, attended church, sponsored community events, provided loans and support to people in need. This wasn't altruism. It was strategic community management. Johnson understood that maintaining good relationships with Harlem residents was essential to operating successfully. People wouldn't inform on him if they viewed him as a community member rather than as pure criminal exploiter. Churches wouldn't oppose him openly if he contributed to their activities. Legitimate business owners would cooperate if he patronized their establishments and helped them when they faced problems. The arrangement also changed how Italian mob families thought about non-Italian operators. Before the Johnson-Luciano deal, the assumption was generally that serious criminal enterprises required Italian management, that colored gangsters, Irish gangsters, Jewish gangsters, anyone outside Italian family structures, they were considered junior partners at best. Employees more typically. Johnson proved that assumption wrong. Demonstrated that black operators could run sophisticated criminal enterprises, maintain discipline, generate reliable revenue, operate professionally. This didn't eliminate racism within organized crime, but it did establish that competence mattered more than racial assumptions when it came to territorial control. Chapter 8. The Scoreboard. By the time Bumpy Johnson died in 1968, the arrangement he'd negotiated with Lucky Luciano in 1936 had been functioning for 32 years. That's an extraordinarily long period of stability in the criminal world, where partnerships often dissolve into violence, where territorial arrangements get renegotiated by force, where the average alliance lasts perhaps 5 years before someone decides to break it. The durability of the Johnson-Luciano arrangement came from aligned incentives. Luciano got reliable income without management costs. Johnson got protection and operational autonomy. Harlem operators got stability that allowed them to build profitable operations without constant threat of takeover. The system worked for everyone involved. The financial numbers were staggering. Over 32 years, Luciano and his successors collected an estimated $205 million from the Harlem arrangement. That's in 1930s to 1960s dollars, equivalent to perhaps $200 double billion today, adjusted for inflation. For Johnson and Harlem operators, the remaining 80% represented even more substantial wealth, estimated at $80.70 a million. Across those decades, that money had real effects on Harlem's economy. It employed thousands of people over the years as runners, collectors, bookkeepers. But they're ticking now. It flowed into legitimate businesses, real estate investments, community institutions. The policy banks became such an established part of Harlem life that they were openly discussed, widely participated in, accepted as normal commerce despite being illegal. Chapter 8. The Scoreboard. By the time Bumpy Johnson died in 1968, the arrangement he'd negotiated with Lucky Luciano in 1936 had been functioning for 32 years. That's an extraordinary long period of stability in the criminal world, where partnerships often dissolve into violence, where territorial arrangements get renegotiated by force, where the average alliance lasts perhaps 5 years before someone decides to break it. The durability of the Johnson-Luciano arrangement came from aligned incentives. Luciano got reliable income without management costs. Johnson got protection and operational autonomy. Harlem operators got stability that allowed them to build profitable operations without constant threat of takeover. The system worked for everyone involved. The financial numbers were staggering. Over 32 years, Luciano and his successors collected an estimated $20.25 million from the Harlem arrangement. That's in 1930s to 1960s dollars, equivalent to perhaps $200.250 million today adjusted for inflation. For Johnson and Harlem operators, the remaining 80% represented even more substantial wealth, estimated at $80.100 million across those decades. That money had real effects on Harlem's economy. It employed thousands of people over the years as runners, collectors, bookkeepers. It flowed into legitimate businesses, real estate investments, community institutions. The policy banks became such an established part of Harlem life that they were openly discussed, widely participated in, accepted as normal commerce despite being illegal. The arrangement also demonstrated something that challenged conventional wisdom about organized crime. Most people assume criminal enterprises require constant violence to maintain, that territories get contested regularly, that the criminal world is inherently unstable. The Johnson-Luciano partnership showed that with proper structure and aligned incentives, criminal operations could be remarkably stable, could function almost like legitimate businesses with contracts and dispute resolution mechanisms. Law enforcement struggled with this stability. Police and federal agents understood that massive illegal gambling operations were functioning in Harlem. They knew who ran them. They could see the money flowing through the community. But the operations were so deeply embedded in neighborhood life, so careful about public violence, so protected by political connections that Luciano's organization provided, that breaking them proved extremely difficult. Several major investigations targeted Johnson over the years. He was arrested multiple times. One sentence, when Mikey stopped talking, served 2 significant prison sentences, one in the late 1940s, another in the late 1950s. But even when Johnson was incarcerated, the arrangement with Luciano's organization continued. Other operators maintained the system, continued paying the tax, kept Harlem's rackets organized. When Johnson was released, he resumed his position without disruption. This demonstrated another remarkable aspect of the arrangement. It had become institutional rather than personal. Early on, the deal was between Johnson and Luciano specifically, but over time, it evolved into an agreement between organizations. When Luciano was deported in 1946, the arrangement transferred to other mob figures. When Johnson was in prison, other Harlem operators maintained it. The system had become larger than any individual. The broader impact on organized crime was subtle but significant. Other mob families watched the Harlem arrangement, saw that it worked, saw that territorial deals with non-Italian operators could be maintained profitably. This created precedent, made it easier for similar arrangements to develop in other cities, other neighborhoods. Detroit's black policy operators negotiated protection deals with Italian families. Chicago's black gangsters established territorial understandings. Philadelphia, Cleveland. Several cities developed arrangements modeled partly on what Johnson and Luciano had established. Not identical, not always successful, but inspired by the proof that such arrangements could work. Chapter 9. The realization they couldn't ignore. Looking back from 1968, when Bumpy Johnson died of a heart attack while having breakfast at Wells Restaurant on 7th Avenue, the question that dominates is, why did the arrangement work when so many similar partnerships failed? The answer comes from what Lucky Luciano understood in 1936, that other mob figures either didn't grasp or refused to accept. He understood that controlling territory doesn't require occupying it, that taking 20% of revenue without management costs is better than taking 80% with all the headaches of direct operation. That respecting competent operators regardless of race makes more business sense than insisting on racial hierarchies that create resentment and resistance. The people who underestimated this arrangement were the other Italian mob families who initially opposed it. Genovese, Profaci, several others argued in 1936 that Luciano was being too generous, that colored operators couldn't be trusted to run operations professionally, that Harlem should be taken over directly and managed like any other territory. They were proven wrong by 32 years of reliable payments, stable operations, and minimal problems. The arrangement Luciano established generated more profit with less trouble than direct control would have produced. The proof was in the money that arrived weekly for decades, in the absence of the kind of warfare and police attention that would have resulted from Italian families fighting over Harlem. Chapter 9. The realization they couldn't ignore. Looking back from 1968, when Bumpy Johnson died of a heart attack while having breakfast at Wells Restaurant on 7th Avenue, the question that dominates is, why did the arrangement work when so many similar partnerships failed? The answer comes from what Lucky Luciano understood in 1936, that other mob figures either didn't grasp or refused to accept. He understood that controlling territory doesn't require occupying it, that taking 20% of revenue without management costs is better than taking 80% with all the headaches of direct operation, that respecting competent operators regardless of race makes more business sense than insisting on racial hierarchies that create resentment and resistance. The people who underestimated this arrangement were the other Italian mob families who initially opposed it. Genovese, Profaci, several others argued in 1936 that Luciano was being too generous, that colored operators couldn't be trusted to run operations professionally, that Harlem should be taken over directly and managed like any other territory. They were proven wrong by 32 years of reliable payments, stable operations, and minimal problems. The arrangement Luciano established generated more profit with less trouble than direct control would have produced. The proof was in the money that arrived weekly for decades, in the absence of the kind of warfare and police attention that would have resulted from Italian families fighting over Harlem. What they learned, eventually, was that criminal enterprise follows business logic more than racial logic, that competent operators create more value than racial solidarity, that deals maintained through mutual benefit last longer than arrangements enforced through violence and occupation. Vincent Mangano learned this lesson in December 1937 when the commission fined him $50,000 and ordered him out of Harlem. He'd assumed Luciano's arrangement was weakness, that challenging it would demonstrate Mangano's strength and ambition. Instead, he learned that Luciano had enough authority within the commission to make his territorial deals binding, that violating them carried real consequences. The Harlem community learned something different but equally important. They learned that their neighborhood's criminal economy could be controlled by black operators who lived in the community, who understood local dynamics, who at least pretended to care about Harlem as more than just profit source. This didn't make Johnson a hero. He was still a criminal profiting from illegal gambling that hurt families. But compared to Dutch Schultz's occupation, compared to the alternative of Italian families running everything from downtown, Johnson's control was preferable. The lesson that lasted longest, that influenced organized crime for decades after both Johnson and Luciano were gone, was about respect and professionalism. The arrangement worked because both sides treated it professionally. Johnson paid accurately and reliably. Luciano provided real protection. Neither side tried to renegotiate through force. Problems got solved through communication rather than violence. This sounds almost mundane, boring even. But in the criminal world of the 1930s through 1960s, where agreements were regularly violated, where violence was the default response to disputes, where racial prejudice often determined who got opportunities, the Johnson-Luciano arrangement was genuinely unusual. It proved that criminal organizations could operate across racial lines if there was mutual benefit and mutual respect. It demonstrated that territorial arrangements based on sound business logic could last for decades. And it showed that sometimes the most profitable approach is giving capable people autonomy to do what they do well, rather than trying to control everything directly. When Frank Costello walked into that brownstone parlor in April 1936 and offered Bumpy Johnson control of Harlem in exchange for 20% of revenue, most observers would have predicted the arrangement would last perhaps 2 years before collapsing into violence and betrayal. It lasted 32 years, generated tens of millions of dollars, became the model for territorial arrangements in other cities, and established principles about race, respect, and criminal cooperation that influenced organized crime for generations. That's what the smart people initially got wrong. They assumed racial prejudice would override business logic. They assumed Italian families would eventually try to take over Harlem directly. They assumed black operators couldn't maintain the kind of professional organization that such an arrangement required. Bumpy Johnson and Lucky Luciano proved them wrong, built something that lasted, created an arrangement that benefited both sides for decades, and demonstrated that in the criminal world, as in legitimate business, competence and mutual benefit matter more than assumptions about racial hierarchies. The neighborhood never forgot. Harlem residents told stories about Johnson for decades after his death, about how he'd stood up to Dutch Schultz, about how he'd negotiated with Lucky Luciano as equals, about how he'd kept Harlem's rackets under local control for 32 years despite Italian mob power and political connections. Those stories weren't necessarily accurate in all details. They left out the violence Johnson used to maintain control. They romanticized his relationship with the community. They simplified the complex arrangement with Luciano into a simple narrative about racial pride and local autonomy. But the core truth remained. Bumpy Johnson had taken an offer from Lucky Luciano in spring 1936 and turned it into 32 years of stability, profitability, and local control. That was real, that mattered. That changed Harlem in ways both positive and negative, that lasted long after both men were gone.